Welcome, my name is Richard Bingley. I am the Managing Director of GBS, and some of you will know me from previous roles. Buckinghamshire University, when I was working in Westminster in government, quite a few of you from those times, it's been 12, 13 years now, so nice to see you. My publisher is here, Sophie Sayer, from IT Governance, and many of you that have been part of my network over the years, so thanks for coming. Tonight, we are hosting this for you on behalf of GBS because there's so much talk in the media around crisis, and there's so much discussion around how people respond, to crisis. And we just thought, well, let's all sit down in a room and consider this and get some different speakers to address this issue, about crisis. It's important to do that because we've got a journalist here, but often in the media, we get focused on the day-to-day stuff. We don't really step away from it. So this is a time to hear 4 different perspectives on what leaders do, or what they think, or how they look at the world, and then just to take it away and learn from that. I would say that I didn't expect, when I was studying security way back in university, and I was working in business in London and then working in government, I never expected a US president to tweet someone that's running a nuclear arsenal and call him Rocket Man. I never expected that. But then I never expected the North Korean president, who's in charge of the nuclear arsenal, to return with the phrase, that's coming from a mad, deranged US dotard. And if anyone wants to know what the word dotard means, you can see it in the 1980s English dictionary. When you sort of think about Brexit, things are not that uncertain, I think we'll find tonight. Things are not as uncertain as they are maybe at a geopolitical level. So we've got 4 speakers. The first is known to me from the world of journalism, David Maddox, who has been at the Daily Express for many years, but last year transferred across to the Sunday desk, so the Sunday Express political editor. After that we'll hear from Jason Towse, who's a personal friend, and Jason runs Mitie, and I know Jason sort of around 10 years, interesting views on leadership. Jason talked, I think, more around sort of mergers, acquisitions, that type of thing. Ian, who I've known, Ian Carter was commander in the Met Police when I first knew you, and we've both gone through various iterations of jobs, but Ian's been very much interested in and sort of planning around crisis management and the security of very kind of high profile, high target government organisations. And then finally, if we get some time, I will kind of reflect and wrap up. So without further ado, I would introduce David Maddox, political editor of the Sunday Express. David, give him a round of applause.
Thank you very much for inviting me, and it's good to be here in an evening of live news. So as I was leaving Parliament to walk up the road to come here, I bumped into a prominent Brexiteer Tory MP on his way to the 1922 committee, and he said, "You're going the wrong way." I said, "I'm just off to give a speech on political leadership." He says, "Well, if you find any, please let me know." So, this is the times we live in, and of course, in fact, the whole introduction of my speech has just changed because the Prime Minister has just now committed to leaving when a withdrawal agreement is passed, and which probably says more about it says a lot about her leadership and what people think about it. So in the very not distant future, in fact I think on the front page of the Standard today, but we will be having a Conservative leadership campaign and election, and the various candidates will be putting themselves out. And so, when Conservative MPs come to replace Theresa May, and there's at least 12, maybe 20 who think they can fill her shoes, then they're going to be weighing a number of factors in their minds. And you've got to remember, this is the most ruthless, oldest political party in the world, so there's a reason it survived. So, they're going to be thinking, does that person have personality, vision, charisma, an ability to communicate? Because we're in the times we're in, Brexiteers versus Remainers and all that, I think unusually for the Conservative Party, ideology will play an important role. I'd be astonished if a Brexiteer is not in the last two but goes to the membership. I'd be astonished if a Brexiteer doesn't win the contest. But most important for the Conservative Party is that person the winner? And can they beat Jeremy Corbyn, or actually can they beat somebody better than Jeremy Corbyn if Labour gets around to replacing him? So with political leadership, because politics is often defined by failure, it's actually easier to look at what makes a bad leader. And I've had my experience of bad leaders in doing my job. I've been a journalist for about 20 years and working in politics since about 2003. So when I was preparing this talk, I came across a clip from Jeremy Paxman appearing on that show, Room 101, where you chuck in things that you really don't like, and he put up David Cameron as his person to put into thing to put into Room 101, and he said that David Cameron was the worst Prime Minister since Lord North. Because quotes, he put party before referendum. Now, I'm sure you're an educated bunch, but just in case, Lord North was in the 18th century. His miscalculations and generally appalling leadership led to the loss of the American colonies and the emergence of the United States. So he sets the bar for bad prime ministers, and so to be compared to him is pretty bad. So, but is this a fair reflection on Cameron? He's somebody I've had a lot of dealings with. I mean, so Cameron, you have to remember, brought the Conservatives back from the wilderness into power in 2010. He managed to persuade the Lib Dems to come into government with him, and then he won an election against the odds. And one thing as well you could say about Cameron, and this is quite important for political leaders in Britain, is that he passed what we call in the lobby the dinner test. So is this somebody you would like to take out for dinner? Do you think you'll have a good evening with this person? And Cameron definitely was the case. I mean, I didn't have dinner with him, but I was in a fair number of social events with him. I have to say I was a bit bored with talk about tennis, but but he was certainly able to talk on a range of issues. He was an intelligent and engaging human being. But the problem with Cameron is that he was, his style of government was known as chumocracy, or sofa politics. He liked this kind of surrounding himself with friends and his kind of relaxed style of making decisions and things. And in the end, that led to him just surrounding himself with people like himself. So, they were all, and I hope I don't offend people because I'm privately educated myself, but they were all posh, privately educated Oxbridge types. And nobody there to, what we say, speak truth to power, which is a very important thing in politics. You need somebody who can tell you you're an idiot. And Cameron lacked that because he did have somebody. He had Andy Coulson, who of course was the former editor of the News of the World and lost his, was basically forced out because of a phone hacking scandal. Andy Coulson was working class background, was a proper hack, as we say in newspapers, and would just tell the Prime Minister what it was, as it was. And once he was gone, it was he had a problem. He didn't have anybody like that. And Blair had the same problem, incidentally, when Alistair Campbell was forced out at the end of the Iraq debacle. And it was no coincidence that Blair's demise came quickly after Campbell's departure. So with Cameron, when it came to the EU referendum, he gambled. and he made the wrong calculation. He could scare people, scare the little people, basically, into voting to stay in the EU without offering a positive vision, and there was nobody there to tell him that he was being stupid. And that actually, speaking as one of my former jobs as the Westminster correspondent for the Scotsman, he almost lost Scotland for exactly the same reason. And what should have been a easy contest became a very close contest for exactly the same reason. So, but we're still with the EU referendum. He creates this mess. He doesn't allow the government to plan for this mess, and then the next morning he's off, he quits. And in the end, quitters don't make great leaders, and he'll be remembered for that being his epitaph. Theresa May had somewhat the opposite problem with Cameron. It was a sense he definitely would not want to invite her to dinner. She's one of the most boring people you can ever come to. I mean, the whole kind of thing of running through a field of wheat, it's been the most interesting thing from her childhood. Or, I remember being on a plane going to one of the conferences, I think to China or somewhere, and John Stevens from the Daily Mail just asked her an interesting question, just to try and get something out of her, and said, "Can you, are you concerned that more people apply for Love Island than apply for Oxbridge?" And it was like, I don't really watch much television. So, and there was a sheer look of panic on her face. It's just, I know I've never been out for lunch with her, but colleagues of mine who have were literally to a man and woman, so they were trying to escape after the first 5 minutes because there was just nothing to be said. Gordon Brown had very much the same problem. His ability to small talk, he just no ability to small talk and communicate or something. I remember being at the Scottish Labour conference, and we were all shuffled into this room to meet the Prime Minister then, and in comes Gordon, and made to, and he could barely say hello to anybody. There was one of my colleagues tried to have a conversation with him. It was just so awkward. It was just, it was actually just incredibly embarrassing. And Brown had, and May both had deep principles, and that helped carry them to a large degree. But both of them also suffered from a problem, and this is a great weakness in our political system, was that they became leader and Prime Minister because it was their turn. And, it wasn't a proper contest. Neither of them actually faced the scrutiny of a proper contest. And, so none of their weaknesses came out of that. And it was, appointing somebody because it's their turn is probably the worst thing. Well, maybe the second thing, I'll get onto the worst thing later. But that can happen. One thing that can be said about Brown, though, is he had a bit of a kind of cultish set of followers about him, and I've never understood why. But this brings us on to another type of leader, and this is the cult leader. And of course, we now have Jeremy Corbyn, who is in many ways the ultimate cult leader. Now, whatever you think about his policies, I'm sure there's probably not many fans in the room, but whatever. We have a strange situation where a white-bearded, grouchy old man has inspired a massive following across the country, and this is largely in his case because he's an ideological leader. He's the most ideological leader we've had certainly since the Second World War of a major political party. In completely rigid, I could see you questioning that, but some might say Margaret Thatcher was an ideological leader. Margaret Thatcher was actually remarkably pragmatic until around circa 1987, and then it all went wrong for her, actually. But he's completely fixed, and it's the problems then with the kind of cult leader is it actually becomes very dangerous. So questioning him actually becomes an act of betrayal. Sorry, hi Peter. Questioning him, you know about cultish leaders, but questioning him becomes an act of betrayal. And there's virtually no capacity for self-reflection in those circumstances. So with Labour, we've seen this very evidently with the anti-Semitism issue. And it is this inability to reflect on themselves and to criticise a leader that has allowed this whole anti-Semitism saga to grow legs and just get completely out of control. And but we also see it with the vitriolic attacks on critics, and I mean particularly on the Labour MPs who criticised him. Literally bricks through windows, camped outside their offices, the terrible stuff online, social media. The other equally cultish leader I've come across is Alex Salmond. I've spent a lot of time following Alex Salmond, and I mean, I've been with him in Edinburgh and Aberdeen, in the street, and there are people running out, wanting a selfie, wanting his, autograph, all the rest of it, and it is obsessive, or it was obsessive actually until recent events, but it's absolutely obsessive. And he's actually a more impressive politician actually than Corbyn, because Corbyn can't get his MPs on side. Salmond had his MPs, MSPs on site, and he had this kind of huge cultish following as well amongst the kind of ordinary people. So if we look at the possible candidates to replace Theresa May, of course the obvious cult leader is Boris Johnson, and some of you may disagree with that, but he's certainly got the celebrity status. Again, I remember during the last election I managed to track him down to Dagenham, which is not exactly a Conservative stronghold, and this phenomena of people running out of shops just to shake his hand, just to have a picture taken with him. There's something about Boris that is more than ideology, more than party. It's about his personality. And but one thing I would say though about cult leaders before I go off is that nationalist movements often attract cult leaders, and that doesn't make the nationalist movements wrong. But if we look at Nigel Farage with UKIP, he was very much in that sort of vein, and is very much in that sort of vein. Moving on, the ability to make speeches is important, but often overestimated. So, we often think of great leaders, like Kennedy and things, great speeches, but, I'll give you an example. The best speech I've heard from a British political leader was from the worst British political leader I've covered in my time, and that's Ed Miliband. He gave a fantastic, amazing One Nation speech, people literally crying in Manchester in about 2013, I think it was. It was a stunning speech, full of vision, full of inspiration, no notes. Cameron got the leadership for giving a kind of similarly inspirational speech with no notes. Didn't turn out particularly well. The rest of Miliband's career as leader was a complete catastrophe. He was, he had no, he was so indecisive, and people were so unwilling to follow him, and he completely lost control of internal politics, which actually, around selection, there was an issue in Scotland around a selection being fixed, and he panicked, and he opened up the entire selection thing, which allowed momentum into the party and has now given us Jeremy Corbyn. So, and part of the problem, the Miliband problem, is that he was, and this is the one thing that's worse than Muggins' turn, is that he was chosen because he wasn't somebody else. He was chosen because he was not his brother David. And the Conservative version of that was Ian Duncan Smith, who was chosen because he was not Michael Portillo or Ken Clarke. Ed Miliband led Labour into a fairly catastrophic election. And he's, the idea that you compromise and end up with somebody less good just because they're not somebody else is in my view a major failing in our system. It has given us a history of poor leaders, poor political leaders. You could say Miliband was unlucky. John Major always claimed he was unlucky. Napoleon says, "Give me a lucky general rather than a good one." But frankly, crisis can sometimes make a great leader. You make your own luck, and both Major and Miliband were basically undone by their own poor decisions and inability to lead. So, are there any good political leaders? Enoch Powell famously said that all political careers end in failure, and you could say that means that there aren't. But I think there have been some outstanding leaders, and I was having a conversation earlier about Margaret Thatcher. I never covered her as a journalist, but there's no doubt she was an outstanding political leader. But at the moment, I would say the best two political leaders in Britain are both in Scotland. They're both women. One is Nicola Sturgeon, and one is Ruth Davidson, and they are outstanding actually, because they are both good but not brilliant speech makers. They're both charismatic, but don't have cult followers. They both understand the political zeitgeist in their part of the UK, and they both have strategic minds, and people are willing to follow them and do what they suggest. And this is why the independence dream in Scotland is not dead. I'm not a great fan of the independence dream, I should say, but it's not dead. It's partly because of Sturgeon, or a lot to do with Sturgeon, but also, probably more importantly, the Conservative Party has literally risen from the grave. It was dead in Scotland, and that is almost entirely down to Ruth Davidson, who I think is a brilliant political leader. I'm not commenting on their policies. And in fact, but in terms of, I'm commenting on people's leadership ability. And the one thing I'd say about Ruth as well, and I can say this from personal experience, is she definitely passes the dinner test or the having a pint test, because you can go and meet Ruth and have a great evening talking about all sorts of things and come back thinking, what a wonderful person. And this is very much at the heart of the Conservative revival in Scotland, actually, that they have somebody like that. So, but for me, the best leader I've covered as a journalist, and I suspect this isn't going to be a popular view for everybody, but is without doubt Tony Blair. And he was, he wasn't perfect, and the Iraq War, which was essentially driven by his ideology. It wasn't an oil grab business, it was driven by his ideology. If you look at his famous speech in Chicago, where he was saying that Western democracies like Britain needed to go and be removing his toxic regimes. He's left a terrible legacy through Iraq, and an awful lot of what's happened since that. But my best memory of Blair was when I was working for the Portsmouth News, and I went to regional Poleds do at Downing Street, and he walked into the room, and I knew he'd walked into the room before I saw him, because my back was turned to him, because you could feel the presence of the man. And he was hugely charismatic at the height of his powers. He was a fantastic speech maker. People certainly followed him. He was a winner. He had 3 massive election victories. We're having a bit of a debate about his legacy, but he certainly in his first term, he changed Britain quite dramatically with devolution and bringing more of a social democratic model, whether you like that or not. But he certainly had the achievements, at least early on. And I still believe that had Brown not deposed him, then Cameron would not have won in 2010. I still believe that, and a lot of colleagues think that too. So, I think he was a leader the Conservatives always wished they had at the time. A lot of people called him Tory in lab. And but you know, and I suspect in terms of ability, not in ideology, but in ability, he's probably the leader they wish they could choose from now. I can tell you, none of the 12 or 20 or whatever have that. So, just want to finish off though with a quote from the person who's met more prime ministers, US presidents, world leaders than any of us and anybody ever will do, probably, and that's the Queen, Elizabeth II. And she said, "I know of no single formula for success, but over the years I have observed that some attributes of leadership are universal and are often about finding ways of encouraging people to combine their efforts, their talents, their insights, their enthusiasm and their inspiration to work together." One thing I would say though, in her reign, excluding Churchill, who was kind of clinging on to power when she came in, there have only been two outstanding prime ministers, Thatcher and Blair, in terms of political leaders. And, you know, it is, which suggests a problem in our system, I would say. And, you know, political leadership, like in business, in the military, whatever, is very important. You know, as Alexander the Great said, give me an army of sheep led by a lion rather than an army of lions led by a sheep. And, you know, the Brexit mess that we are in now is all down to a failure of political leadership. And whatever comes after Theresa May, that needs to be resolved.
Brilliant. Thanks, Lee. Next speaker is Ian Carter, who, when I first met Ian, I think you were commander in the Met Police of Counter-Terrorism Operations, am I right? Yep. And then after that, Ian left the police and went into various sort of niche security management and directorship roles. He's now working with Source 8, who are very, very well known. For those that don't know Source 8, very, very well known in the kind of security intelligence field over the last few years. So Ian, we welcome you to the platform. Thank you. Ian. Well, you just hit space, I think.
Right, lovely. Look, thank you, like everybody else, for letting me come along and have this opportunity to speak. I spoke, and I'm going to speak about leadership in crisis, just a little bit around what it is. I'm going to take you through a journey on that. It's going to be my journey. I'm not going to bore you with my life or anything like that, but the reality is my experience of leading in crisis, and I'll let you choose whether I did well. There will be a number of examples, a number of circumstances, and many of them you'll know because they're very high profile. The one good bit of news is, apart from the occasional bit of television, I've done everything I can to avoid being in the public eye, but unfortunately I can't avoid it. I don't normally use post-nominals, I'm sure everybody in the room's got dozens of them, but because we're in the Institute of Directors, I am a fellow of the Institute, so I just thought I'd shove that up today. It's a courtesy more than anything else. So, look, I'm a former Metropolitan Police Chief Officer. My last 4 years were in counter-terrorism. Embarrassingly for me, but one of my former colleagues is in the audience who used to be the head of National Counter-Terrorism Security Office, and I can tell you this country's a lot safer because of that guy in this audience today. And we'll cover some of the things we did. But look, counter-terrorism, I think I've got a background in operational policing, and most of my career has been as a detective. SIO stands for Senior Investigating Officer, I'm accredited one. So over my life I've dealt with many murders, many kidnaps, many those sort of things, like regular sort of child abusers and everything like that, right across the piece of policing. But I knew Richard when he was at London First. That's when we first met, and he played a part there in helping people there mentor me, and there were people from the business sector who helped me lead in my big commands in a way that was actually different to the way I was used to doing it in policing. So it was a different model and an excellent way. So it was actually, I went into consulting, if I'm really honest. That was the wonderful world I went into. Initially with PA Consulting in the defence and security, mainly with Deloitte, and I've been for the last 8 or 9 years an advisor to McKinsey's. So it's not a bad CV for if you're into consulting. It's not bad. Well, what I did it is another matter, but the reality is there. And what I do over these years for those consultants and professional services is advise on how to deal with crisis and crisis management and everything else. And it's very important that I talk about it as crisis management, because as I go through this in a moment, we'll see that there is a difference, in my opinion, between general leadership and leadership in crisis. This is the only really busy slide. I apologise for that because I know there's some academics in the audience, so we thought we'd do a little bit of words in there. But people always say, what's the difference between leadership and management? There is a distinct difference. And the difference is in the origin of the word. Manager comes from the Latin manus, which means hand. And over the years, British military, sailors and soldiers, particularly in the 16th century, working in the Italian environment, learned that they used it for a way of controlling and handling horses. It was a sort of handling process. And you'll recognise it for those that are into equine sort of things, would know that the word exists in other bits of life around horses. The important thing is that word was brought back by the military and the sailors, and progressively it became a way of handling ships and groups of people. But leaders, the word comes from led. It's a northern European word, pretty common right across the piece, and it means about guiding, taking on a journey. It's really important that that is distinctly different, because in a crisis situation, it's leadership that's needed, not management. Management will support it rather. Management will give you all the things you need to make it work and everything else. But as was said by David and Jason, the reality is that you do need good leadership. We've all got quotes. These are my favourite too. This is about the relationship. We just had that from Jason. But if there's one that makes the whole point, it's that one there from Warren Bennis. And he says, look, it's a bit like beauty. It's hard to define, but when you see it, you'll recognise it and you'll know it. In crisis, you have to have someone that will lead you in that sort of way. So, because it's a crisis, and I do the academic bit again, you should break down the heading, so I've done that. So I've done the leadership bit. For the crisis bit, that's my preferred one, but there will be others. The reason it's on Mitie slides is the bit that I didn't explain at the beginning is, I'm actually the group head of risk for Mitie, but I also head the consulting arm as well. It's got about 7 jobs. Jason is actually my boss, so I'm glad he's gone. But he's the managing director of the whole security bit. It's only one part of Mitie, but I work for him, but I also do security advising and consulting as well. But look, we have our own version, it's not this one. But this is my preferred one, and it tells you exactly how it would impact on an organisation and why it's so important. So what's my command experience and golden experience? Look, I always throw Wembley up there. I was the borough commander, the chief superintendent of Brent, one of my commands, and was there for the closing of Wembley over the last about dozen or so events as a gold commander, from Oasis right through to English football games to Celine Dion. Even we had Rolling Stones there, and policed it as a football thing. It's not the best thing for people of mine now, age 60-somethings, that are trying to get out when you're used to taking 20-somethings from the football ground. And then Wembley's shut, I did the Arsenal as a Tottenham supporter. That was always an interesting dynamic. But there we go. I've got a vast experience of public order, firearms, gold commander, event management, and I mentioned the SIO. I've been Gold London. What does that mean? When there are a number of events in London, so you've got Wembley on, Twickenham on, marches through London and everything else, you have an ultimate goal that does that particular bit. I'm going to mention the Morris inquiry in a minute, because I don't want it all seem like it's public order, fighting people and investigating crime, because actually there's some long-term crisis stuff as well. I did the first 2 nights of the tsunami on Boxing Day, and I'll come back to those in a moment. 21/7, I was a chief officer on call. I'll take you through that in a few moments. That is a real crisis stuff. I was the Olympic lead for the counter-terrorism strand until I retired from policing. I was the gold for the aviation part at Heathrow and City airports for the London commands for the 2006 transatlantic plots. The reason you get searches, you go every time now, it's pretty much down to myself and a couple of other people. I apologise now, I go through the searches myself. And then Chris is here as well. I had a big part to play in the protect side of things, as did Chris, post Haymarket and Glasgow. So 3 quick ones for you, different ones. First time I've had a Christmas off, 25 years service at the time. I'd never had a Christmas off. I worked every Christmas day for 25 years. There's a dad and a wife's a detective sergeant in the police as well. That's quite difficult. I got this year off, 2004. I joined in 1978. And the reality is that you know what happened. horrific events, and I'm at home and I get the phone call, we've got nobody else, can you come in and do it? Yeah, well, that's what you do, don't you? If you're the press, you come in, if you're whatever, and CEOs and everything in the audience. I was called into it. The first night, so it's happened, we were watching it on the telly, that night was just trying to get it all together, trying to get the casualty bureau up and running for the phone calls coming and everything else. The second night was a difficult one, because when I woke up at lunchtime in the afternoon, the Met Police were getting lambasted. It's nothing new, it happens for the two Met cops in there. I can tell you it happens every day of our lives, but the reality is we are terrible. And the reason we were terrible is we'd set up a casualty bureau that couldn't take hundreds of thousands of people literally ringing in. It would take many at that level. And it failed. And the press were having a field day. And I do not blame them one bit. We are failing to deliver what we should be able to do. People are worried. People are on holiday, many of their families, and nobody knows. So my big job on that second night was to get that sorted out. And by the time my night finished, which had my own crisis in it, which is that 15 people were dead at that stage by the end of that second night from the UK. My crisis was at 3 a.m. My wife got rushed into hospital with a quite serious thing, which is why we did the first 2 nights of tsunami, because I was at hospital for the rest of the time after that. She was fine. I could see the care and in the fruit, but I promise you it really impacts on me. That's Bill Morris. Bill Morris, who many of you will know. And the Metropolitan Police, after the death of Stephen Lawrence, was quite rightly, and I mean quite rightly, held to account and was described and found to be institutionally racist. It doesn't matter about individuals, doesn't matter about my personal view, it doesn't matter about Chris's, who was met at the time as well. As an organisation, we were. How we came up with policies and everything else, because it was influenced by race and diversity. Bill Morris was brought in to do an investigation and run an inquiry into the police service, particularly the Metropolitan Police, to find out how racist we were and the ways. Now the point is, it was a slow burn crisis now. We know they're going to do the inquiry, so I chair the Gold Group on behalf of the Met. What does that mean? I have to get everything about risk and resources sorted out. Then the inquiry's run, and then of course the most difficult bit at the end is the report is printed and the impact on the police. So there's a long burn one, so it's not 2 or 3 days and everything else. Sometimes a crisis can really drag itself out. And then 21/7, I put the offenders up there, because I spent the first few hours trying to track them down and catch them. I was the chief officer on call that day. I had been all that week for London, and I'd just come from the House of Parliament on a meeting from the 7/7 bombings. You've got to remember this is 2 weeks later. London is just kind of getting itself back together. Still big fear, we've got cops everywhere, soldiers everywhere and all that sort of thing. And then this happens. And my first environment thing was to rush down to the control room to be told, actually there's 2 bombs have gone off, but nobody's dead yet, which is a bit different to 7/7. I've been there 5 minutes and the 3rd bomb went off. So I did that too, it was actually 3. And the point about that was, nobody was dying. So you're not just dealing with a crisis, you've not got a backdrop of everything else. Now you start thinking of the worst case scenario. We're talking about undergrounds with noxious gas and it being spread throughout London and everything else. And then of course, as you know, 22nd of July was when the sad death of Jean-Charles Meneses was occurred. But throughout that day and the 22nd and right through the weekend, I led all the firearms operations in a reactive way. So Jean-Charles Meneses died because of a proactive way I had planned event. I dealt with everything else, and we were getting phone calls every 5 minutes saying that there are terrorists here, you know, everything, and it was just a really difficult thing. So I'm just telling you that to give you a whole backdrop of the different things that you can have as a crisis. So I think it's important, so I think, I know some of this actually quite well matches in with what David's told you as well. I think leaders that respond well in crisis are these sort of people. They're naturally resilient, really can take some of this stuff without affecting them too much. They actually understand themselves. They know what happens with them. Handicaps might be an unfortunate one, but what I mean is what restricts what they can do and how they do it. They understand their own crisis and their own things. So take tsunami, second I've got my own crisis. My wife's in hospital and I'm in London and we live in Hertfordshire, so it's not exactly the easiest dynamic in the world. And I've also got 5 children at home on their own. Luckily one of them's old enough to grow up, be old enough to look after them. They have good training and knowledge, I'll come back to some of this. I say they tend to be action heroes, it's actually your point earlier on. These are the good people, the charismatic people that you can lead. Doesn't mean they're hanging around in a Batman suit or something like that on the thing, but it actually means that they can show they're strong and dynamic in how they deliver things. They're people that attract people, same point made by both David and Jason. They're credible thinkers under stress, and I'll come back to some of that in a minute. They handle events well, they have self-confidence and self-esteem, and they have strengths that they recognise that can be helped. So it's not just about identifying weaknesses in themselves, but it's actually these are people that are leaders, that are good in this kind of environment and do everything else. The other things are that the most important thing about leadership in anything, but particularly in this, is these people can be trusted, they're highly trained, they practice this a lot, and the team buy into the leader. Now, you've heard both David and Jason mention that. Leadership doesn't mean anything. If you're a guide and nobody's following you on the journey, it's a ridiculous statement. So in crisis, it's essential that the team work well together. Of course, the one thing you can't do is panic. I hope everybody knows that it's always questionable about something because it's something a while ago now. But don't panic, Captain Mannering, and all that sort of thing is the thing. But really, good leaders in crisis situations just can't panic. It just doesn't go together, they correlate. So it's worth making that point. Panic is where you're feeling trapped. It's an isolated sort of feeling, you can't do anything. So the most important thing in a crisis is you're not trapped. On 21/7, I was in the control area where it was all very proximate, lots of people sitting there and everything else. And the best way to deal with it, funny enough, I've got 4 big television screens in front of me where I was watching every tactic I was putting in and going on, with people being followed and everything else. I was watching it play out on Sky News and the BBC. It was much better than watching it on there because I was getting better feedback than I was live from my own offices. But the point was I got out into the environment outside the control bit just so I could see what was going on. Panic is, of course, associated with premorbid senses. The reason that is because you feel like you're panicking close to death and everything else, or you're certainly vulnerable. And you need to be aware of those, what brings a panic on, that heartbeat and everything else. So those are the kind of physical things. But a lot of people don't realise this, that if your heartbeat is monitoring more than 100 beats a minute, you stop being rational. That doesn't mean when you're out for a run or whatever or anything like that. But actually when you're in that environment where somebody's going, your heartbeat goes up to a certain level, it's very difficult to make rational decisions. You might make a couple, but over a period of time it will lose its effect. I put emotional intelligence, I've heard other people call it the giving tonics and all that kind of thing, which is about people sort of show cathartism and everything else. I think people, if they know how they are cathartic, because we've got an American president every now and then throws a swear word in and everything else, I don't know if it's deliver or whatever. But the point is, I certainly couldn't do that as chief police officer. It would have been a really difficult thing to do. And so you've got to learn how you control your own weaknesses and everything else. So how do you manage it? You get your defence mechanisms. You've got to learn about fight and flight as an individual because you all react in different ways. And literally, that managing unnecessary information is what's important now that will help you make a decision. Because if you're getting lots of information, it's not going to help because you really are lost. So there needs to be some kind of filtering system, and you need to do that yourself. Okay, I'm just going down the rest of the things there because I'm conscious of time. But a lot of these things are about how you act around people. I use the word emotional intelligence because emotional intelligence is thrown around a lot, but there are 4 parts of emotional intelligence, not just about you, and not just about how you people, but how people perceive you and everything else. So there's 4 bits to it, but it's very important that you're aware of your own sort of things. So what works for crisis leaders? I think it's this. It's based on the fact that you have someone that's with you, that really understands both the things that are going on. So many of you will know this. The police use a gold, silver, bronze approach to structural ways of dealing with a crisis. Really, the gold is a strategy group that designs what we're going to do. The silver bit is, that's what we're going to do, this is how we're going to do it. And the bronze bit is, they're the people that put it into action. That's basically it. But we also, you need other things as well. So there's a thing there called Diamond Group. Other people use it sometimes, and as a business, so at Mitie, if we've got a crisis, there will be a crisis team running it. However, business has to continue on. You know, the management of the process has to carry on. And very often the Diamond Group will deal with the politics, will deal with the running of the company. And the reason we call it Diamond rather than Platinum, which would be the obvious thing as gold, silver, bronze, is it has no influence directly on the operation of the crisis. So how do you deal with a crisis? You let the crisis people deal with it, but business as usual carries on. Business continuity kicks in, and then trying to get it back to normal at the end is the way to do it. One thing the Met always do, and policing in this country, is any police officer that says this is a crisis, it's a crisis. Or critical incident, we use the police phrase for it. Why is that important? Because it's easier to de-scout something that started off than it is to try and catch up. So it's an occurring situation. I'm not saying that everybody does it and all resources get chucked at it, but it is a crisis when someone does it. I think everyone in an organisation should be empowered to do that, and that would always be my way of saying it within policing and everything else. Always practice. One thing that many people don't know about 7/7 is that the Met, Army, and the military, and the intelligence services, on the Sunday before 7/7, practice almost, not exactly the same scenario, but a very similar one. So whilst people have been critical about the response, actually it could have been a lot worse because they'd already practiced it and everything went straight into a kind of way of doing it. All right, we're kind of lucky on that, but it can work in a particularly good way. And not every day is a good day. But the reason not every day is a good day is because we don't always feel great. You know, a good leader one day might not be another day. It's not something you can do. And I gave you my personal thing of my wife coming home and me being there and actually suffering with her being in hospital, which was a difficult thing. There are 5 areas. So what's the learning from this? There are 5 areas here. I've got quick slides to give them. You're welcome to have them afterwards. Try to lighten the attitude a little bit and a little bit of fun on the side there. I think crisis teams, there should be a number of senior managers that are identified as crisis leaders that are good at this game. And you train them and you get them all working together. And the most important thing is that you develop a process that everybody understands what they're doing. So that's the 5 headings for it. I'll do it quickly because it gets a bit busy now. So the senior managers, they don't have to be the most senior executives. These are the people that are good at leading in a crisis. So you will get sometimes officers far junior to those of, I think, running some of these incidents. Doesn't mean they can't be taken out, because if they're not doing a great job, you could actually remove them. But the reality is that sometimes actually the best checks, it's like with Myers-Briggs stuff and everything else, isn't it? And the thing is, sometimes your skills are slightly better than the people that sit above you. And anyway, most of the executives can sit on a group that oversees everything and everything else. So empowerment was mentioned earlier on, training and practice, experience sharing, all these sort of things are what makes those group of senior managers really busy. So I'm just conscious of time a bit here. I haven't talked much about this, but this is about the scanning process. It's your intelligence arm. I haven't talked about intelligence because it's part of a bigger presentation. It is important for any organisation that they get information in. It's always a sort of null and void sort of thing, which is what's information, what's intelligence. Well, it's quite clear. Information is pieces of stuff coming in. Intelligence is information that you can look at, analyse, and then action. That's the distinct difference. And so there's no point in getting loads of information in, but it is important to get stuff that you can turn into action and make work. And pretty much everything there is all about developing that scanning process. I didn't mention it, I know the slide's up there. This is a really important bit in crisis management and organisational stuff. It's a phrase which is, you can't plan for everything, but you can plan for anything. Now that sounds, I was doing a master's about Cambridge a few years ago, when I was in the police. The academics there said it's ridiculous, you can't have that. But it's a pragmatic and operational answer, which is, you don't know what's going to happen, you can't plan for everything. You can kind of guess things and that kind of thing. But what you can put in place is the way of dealing with it. It's the pace, the processes to make it work, the training that makes it happen and everything else. So it's important that everything you do down on that list is about, and I'm happy to share these slides by the way, is to make sure that you can put in place so that no matter what happens, you can actually make it happen in the interests of the organisation you do. That was a critical incident thing. Golden hour is a famous policing thing, you've heard it before, but it is really important, that first hour of dealing with a crisis. We had one last week in Mitie that we dealt with very, very quickly, and it's gone. and probably didn't take the first hour, but the first hour's impact on that 2 or 3 hours later was really quite good. And then there's a technology thing there about the support yourselves and everything else. So the reality is that that's about your phones might not work. 7-7 City of London. We're not in the city here, we're in the Met. City of London chose to shut the phones down. Chris diving in the background down there. The reason they did that, we still to this day don't know. So the final slide then, trying to make some fun out of someone's beheading there, but the reality is that I believe there are 3 key bits for leadership, and particularly leadership in crisis. You must always be aware of your vulnerabilities. That is the most important bit. You've always got to be driven by the consequences as they're happening, but you need to be aware of them and try and deal with them and have contingencies in place to sort of mitigate is the old word now. They've got all these T's, tolerate, treat, and etc. and that sort of thing. But the bottom line is to make sure that you deal with it. And then the final one is you remain threat informed. What is going to affect your organisation? And crisis leadership is mainly about the threats. And for me, on 21/7, the biggest threat I had is for the first 4 hours, I thought the person standing next to me was writing a load of information down on my decisions. At 5 o'clock when we reviewed it, the person had done a load of little squiggles all across a bit of paper, and we had spent ages playing the recordings back for my decisions, for the decision logs. Not the best bit of my ever world that I've done, but luckily we were saved by the fact the room was fully recorded. Also helped the inquest and the stuff thereafter. And that's it.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Well, thanks for such a practical presentation, but also bringing the academic side into it, and much better way than the rest of us, I think. So what I'm going to do now is just present for a few minutes. I know we're all sort of quite a long way into the event, but from my own perspective, I was just trying to make sense of Brexit, and after sort of 3 years, I'm going to give you like a business perspective of kind of how I look at it. Being involved in the management of a school that's global, being an entrepreneur, and also, I guess, sort of observing leaders the last sort of 10 or 15 years. My own background is a little bit in political and government relations a few years ago. So I've worked with Tony Blair, worked with all of the individuals being mentioned this evening, including Ed Miliband. Been quite sort of closely, when I say work with, not necessarily supporting sometimes, but sometimes on a logistical area. And then in the corporate world, sort of work with very senior people at Nike, very senior people at other major global firms that have been involved with the Olympics and things. So and I will bring in Brexit as a case study. So when I see leadership, from the leader's perspective, all I see now is this, is people saying, I want it all and I want it now. So, whether it's your customers, whether it's your students, whether it's MPs in Parliament saying this to their party leaders. And this is driven, I think, a lot by digital media and 24/7 news environment. People like Churchill did not have to deal with this pressure of immediacy and this competing interest all the time. I think from a leader's perspective, we kind of want to see things this way. We kind of want people to be a bit dignified and patient. It's a nice quote. I don't necessarily agree with this person, but patience is not simply the ability to wait, it's how we behave when we're waiting. We're not being dignified. No one's being dignified around Brexit here. Everyone is chomping at the bit. If you look at the news organisations, you look at different activists and the rest of it. So how do we as businesses make sense of what's going on? In my life, I've always watched leaders look at things in 3 ways, and I look at things in 3 ways. So when I'm viewing a problem, it might be in like intelligence, it might be running something, you look at things in 3 ways. I always try and get the helicopter view. I don't know what it is in me, but I always try and get above something and get the helicopter view, the overview, because you can see everything that's coming. But sometimes you can't see the ground view. But I think, particularly Americans, Chinese business leaders are very, very good at this. Helicopter view, I have to say, for all of his faults, Donald Trump, very, very good helicopter view because of his corporate background. Not least, he's got about 20 helicopters. But in leadership, then there's a second type of view, I think, and that's kind of the garden view. And you get these people who lead by, maybe they're a little bit remote, but they're to the side of things. Things are quite rosy for them, they might be quite optimistic, but they can't really see sort of what's coming, and they're not really engaged with the staff, they're not really engaged on the ground level. So it's kind of this side view. But we need this, we need the helicopter view as well. But we also need the ground view. Sorry, we've missed a slide maybe. Street view is what I call it. And I think this is the problem around Brexit, I have to say. And leaders in the UK are very much media sensitive. They are very much staff sensitive. And I think they're too grounded on the street level, actually. I think the road is not usually that clear. But actually, you get journalists should be embedded. Journalists should be getting the ground view. But should a CEO, of a big firm? Yes, sometimes they should be listening, but they shouldn't be down there all the time trying to be everyone's best friend, because then the strategy goes. But I think if you look in Parliament, we've got 650 MPs, and most of them are just looking on street level, day-by-day decision making, day-by-day tweets, day-by-day media interviews, aren't actually doing the job. From a UK-British perspective, let's go to the helicopter view, around Brexit. The helicopter view, despite the media, is pretty solid. The UK economy is growing. It's due to grow 1.6, 1.7%, according to people that know what they're talking about. Even when you talk about no deal, as it's defined by a lot of the media, they're saying the worst forecast is 1.2%. So, from a business perspective, this is not a crisis. I don't really know where the media is coming from in terms of Brexit being a crisis. It might be to some particular sectors at some time. Just to give you relative growth figures there, US growth 2.4%. What's interesting, Germany and France, static. This week, growth figures projected at 0.2%. This is a lot to do with the global slowdown. It's nothing to do with something that's quite localised into the European Union. If we take the side view of the UK, actually it's very, very good. So unemployment low, we've got the Norwegian sovereign fund saying it's going to invest in the next 20, 30 years, Gulf sovereign funds coming in. We've got record foreign direct investment. We're the second largest company for FDI behind China, would you believe? So in other words, we're beating America. Forbes magazine American magazine, just rated us again the best country to do business. We've got 7 of the world's top 40 universities. We've got a younger population. We are, when you do the maths and the extrapolations, it is predicted that the UK economy will be larger than Germany over the next half a decade. We are the 3rd largest country for tech. So, not a bad garden view of the UK. But here's where we got stuck, I think, in the last 3 years, is a lot of business leaders, a lot of educators, a lot of politicians just down at the street view. And that's great for journalists, but when you look at things like, I just did a radio interview this week on Google, and Google running virtual nanny, so you can surveil your kids by just putting in a password. You can surveil, had it with your dogs and your pets a couple of years ago. Why are we not regulating? Why are we not legislating in these areas? Because the day-to-day fix is on Brexit. And I think, I've had some quite interesting discussions with other business leaders. And I think one of the reasons actually is a lot of UK business leaders and politicians do not have a business education. They actually don't have an MBA. They don't look at business environments as a global thing. They just read the newspapers. They're quite sort of parochial. But we're very stuck in the street scene. It's very, very noticeable when you sort of look at the work of Vladimir Putin or Xi Jinping about how strategic they are and how they're not necessarily that focused on sort of the day-to-day Twitter stuff. So the top 10 leadership traits are defined as thus. This is the top study ever in business management, the top 10 traits of leaders. This was a survey of 600 American firms 30 years ago. Honest, forward-thinking, inspirational, competent, fair-minded, supportive, broad-minded, intelligent, straightforward, dependable. I put Parliament there. How many people feel that the UK Parliament is hitting most of these as a collective body? That's quite interesting. I didn't expect 0, but I did expect an MP to turn up, so I thought there might be at least 1 in the room. But it's very interesting. You know, I mean, this is not a dislocated audience. This is an audience that's very much business focused, civil society focused. But when you put these 10 traits in around someone like Churchill, who's now not controversial but was very, very controversial, for all of his faults are mostly associated with him being honest, forward-thinking, inspirational. He almost wrecked his political career because he disagreed with Indian independence in the 1930s. It marginalised him from frontline politics. He was in the wilderness for almost 10 years because of that. Forward-thinking. Churchill was the first political leader to talk about Wi-Fi, wireless communications. Was very much into radio. Britain was the world leader in radio from the 1860s. It wasn't America, it was Britain. Competent. What is interesting about some of the leaders we've talked about tonight, including you, Ian, is that actually they might have spread around CVs, but they've done a lot of jobs. And the one concern I have about MPs and a lot of people in government is they've not done a lot in life. Actually, they might have done 1 or 2 jobs and then jumped into being an MP's assistant and then become special advisor if the MP becomes a minister. But actually, competence comes from your life experience. Churchill became Prime Minister in his mid-60s. He'd done about 10 jobs in cabinet. Everyone forgets this about Churchill. You know, he was Chancellor of the Exchequer for 5 years. He was Commonwealth Secretary. He was First Lord of the Admiralty. He was the equivalent of Foreign Secretary, which was Commonwealth Secretary. So he kind of negotiated a lot of things. Straightforward, he told it how it was. And actually, when he made a mistake, he didn't admit it at the time, but he certainly admitted it afterwards. You beat me to it. I was going to ask you who's the greatest political leader in the country today. I totally agree with you, actually, around the Scottish leaders. I was saying this to my brother 2 weeks ago. The 2 most impressive leaders, if you were quantifying the traits of leadership, I would say as Nicola Sturgeon and Ruth Davidson. But as we look at our head of state, actually, who barely ever says anything. It's like my grandmother used to be, but when they did speak up, whoa, you know, you absolutely took on board what they were saying. Very easy to be a good leader, maybe some people would say, if you're not elected. But actually, that's a person of authority. If she didn't have public support, she wouldn't be there, particularly in these times. You know, we would have got rid of them because of the digital media and the ability to remove things we don't like these days. But honest, competent, because she's seen, 13 prime ministers, she's travelled to 200 countries. I would say dependable, but it's a thing about continuity. Time and time again we are told that youth and vibrancy equals good leadership. And I think it's kind of associated with the Camelot presidency in America of JFK, which wasn't necessarily a great presidency. You know, nor was it a long one, because he was assassinated after 2.5 years. Or the kind of the Camelot prime ministership of Blair here, which was actually a very, very well-run administration. It was a superbly run administration. But she has here this dependability, the same that Churchill had. And I think they've just been through a lot more. And I think we write off wisdom in this country so much. I don't want young MPs. I actually love the American system. You have to be 35 to run to be president in America. You know, I mean, what is Austria doing with a 31-year-old prime minister? What's going on there? That's a sign of political failure. I guess sometimes you get the genius of William Pitt, you know, that came in at 24, but that's once every 2 centuries. So I think, I would say sort of the emasculation of wisdom and older people in this country is a big concern for leadership. David, you quoted the Queen, and I think I got the same quote there. But we talked about people all of tonight. And in Brexit, it's always about people. You know, about Boris thinks this, Jeremy thinks that, Hilary Benz tabled this amendment. For business, I don't care. I care about the country. And I just think, look at this country. 1,000 years of the amazing structural things that we've delivered to the world. We're not talking about it. You know, we're not celebrating it. And because we're not talking about it and celebrating it, we've kind of got this crisis of confidence about going through Brexit, which is basically a legal agreement at the end of the day. It's going to go one way or the other. But human rights, for 800 years, innocent until proven guilty, Magna Carta. Bill of Rights, parliamentary sovereignty, 400 years. Stood alone against Nazism. We didn't join with the Americans, they came in after sort of 2 or 3 years, but stood alone, not because they were attacking us, but because the Germans invaded Poland under Nazi rule. All this stuff that we've done, formed the UN Assembly and hosted the United Nations General Assembly here, formed NATO, the greatest military alliance, with deputy head of NATO, the greatest military alliance to stand against the spread of an ideology. Led the world, radio, communications, internet. We set up the internet. We set up radio. Banking and finance. We've got the biggest banks in the world based here. It's the #1 place to do business if you're a bank. We've got Europe's top 2 oil companies based in the UK. And I just want to mention the Olympics in closing. So the Olympic success is very, very intriguing because that was planned. It's about the only thing in national life that was planned. And I don't mean that we planned to host the Olympics, I mean that we planned to win medals. So a whole team went in to the athletes and a whole load of funding went in about 8 years before the 2012 Olympics, not knowing that we would host, hoping we would. And they put in place 6 to 8 year plans for each of the young athletes and funding to support it. So in other words, they were funding and putting in strategies for athletes they did not expect to win in 2012, but they were hoping would then make it in 2016. It's one of the only aspects of British national life that you see successful strategy in these days, was winning. We came 3rd in the medals table in 2012, 27 gold medals. We came 3rd in the medals table in 2016, 29 medals. Streets ahead of competitor countries of our own size, Germany and France. That was not a fluke. It's nothing to do with sport, it's to do with strategy. And it's the one thing that's kind of missing from this Brexit place at the moment. Brexit has just boiled down to, on one side, let's give you an example of a company that's leaving, Nissan. Oh yeah, Nissan is threatening to leave the UK. Next day in the press, different side of the press, great news, Boeing is now going to invest a lot more in the United Kingdom because it's very confident about Brexit. It's just become tit for tat, down in Westminster. A little bit of a game. But for business, what we need is 2 things. If you go online and you Google Russian government strategy, Vladimir Putin, you will see a national strategic plan for Russia. It's not a military plan, it's a national strategic plan. I think it's dated about 2015, just before his last election win. If you do the same, and it's in English now, you'll get the same plan for China, Xi Jinping's plan. You'll probably get a similar plan for Trump. I've not tried that. But what's the entire piece that's missing in London is not a crisis in UK decision making, it's a crisis in politics, I think. They're not hitting any of the leadership traits that we need. And I cannot advise you read this book enough, but strategy is the one thing that is missing. The second thing that is astonishing me, and I think you guys all talked about it, I'm not a sports scientist. I quite like sport, but sports science tells us a lot about how we should approach massive projects and big moments of crisis and change, because it teaches all about resilience. But this study told us how we won those medals. And the key to this is about every single team member pulling together when there's enormous pressure on the overall unit. And from a business perspective, we've seen none of that. My predictions are we will know the next president of the United States is well before we know the impact of Brexit. This is even if there's a deal and it goes through, legally and financially, this is not something that British business can say, okay, that's done and dusted, we know where we stand now. This is at least a decade long thing that we're going to go through, the point of a deal. It will be a decade-long thing for business, decade-long thing for law. Well, my closing thing would be, knowing that, let's just stop looking around the corner. We can't do it all now. If you try and service everything now, then the strategy fails. I think that's the overarching lesson of all of the presentations.